The legendary Sumerian Kings List is considered one of the greatest sources of information on ancient Mesopotamia. On this list, there was a lone female named Kubaba. Her reign of the city-state Kish was around 2500 BC, and she is thought by many to be the first queen in recorded history. Much is unknown about her reign, just like much is unknown to many about this week's story, the first NFL team in the city of Buffalo. And oddly enough, the city of Buffalo has a nickname, and that is the Queen City.
Welcome to the Football History Dude podcast, where each episode is a journey back in time to learn about the rich history of the NFL. Your host is Arnie Chapman. Football is his passion, and he wants you to come along with him to explore the yesteryear of the gridiron. So hop on board his DeLorean and let's get this baby up to 88 miles per hour.
Great Scott!
This time as we step off the DeLorean, the date is April 30th, 1921, and we are at Akron, Ohio, because we are here to witness the Akron Pros be awarded the first ever NFL championship. Now, there's an article from the Akron Beacon Journal dated May 2nd, 1921. It kind of summed it up, and it is stated as such. At the meeting, Frank Need and Art Ranney, owners of the Akron Professional Club, were presented with the large, loving cup donated by the Brunswick Blake Collender, the cup to be personal property of the team winning it 3 years. The Akron team was also officially proclaimed the world's professional football champions of 1920. End quote. Because there you go. Akron Pros, the first ever NFL champion. But wait, you see, this week's guest tells of a story about how this was a closer race than we might have even known. His name is Jeff Miller, and Jeff's going to ride shotgun with us to take us back to that first year to learn about the first team in the city of Buffalo, the first NFL team. Not the Buffalo Bills, hailing from the American Football League. No, we're talking about the Buffalo All-Americans. Now, Jeff himself, he's a Buffalo historian and author, and the reason why I asked him to stop by this week's episode is to drop a little bit of gridiron knowledge nuggets on you about the first true team, the first NFL team, that is, of the Queen City, which is Buffalo. But why him? I mean, well, the dude, he wrote a book on the team and is a walking Buffalo history juggernaut. He's an award-winning author writing around the history of Buffalo, but primarily football related. One book he even co-authored with legendary coach Marv Levy. So, I'll just say, he's got a little bit of knowledge about how football has gone down in the city of Buffalo. And I'll go ahead and leave links to the show notes and to his dedicated page for all of these books so you can go and check them out yourself. And by the way, you can get to the dedicated page for Jeff Miller by heading to thefootballhistorydude.com/Jeff Miller. Again, that's thefootballhistorydude.com/Jeff Miller. Also, I ask that you please subscribe for free to this show by mashing that little subscribe button in your podcast player of choice. That way you get the hottest, freshest out the press episodes, each and every week. But let's get after those gridiron knowledge nuggets on the first NFL team in the city of Buffalo. I turn it over the show to Mr. Jeffrey Miller. Take it away, Jeff. Hey, Jeff, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you for having me, Arnie.
Oh, for sure. And what we want to do here is we want to step off the DeLorean and we want to unpack Jeff Miller. How did you get into football and early professional football it is? You know, tell me that origin story.
Well, when I was younger, I always wanted to be a writer. So I was always, writing and doing whatever, articles. And I had written a local history book. I come from a small town called Lime Lake in New York. And I had written a local history book. And when I was going to write my next book, I had just read about a gentleman named Jim Alinger, who at the time was 99 years old, was the oldest surviving former NFL player. And he was being inducted into Greater Buffalo Sports Hall of Fame. And I was kind of interested in it because I was a football fan, but, I didn't really think much of it. But the funny thing is, a couple of days later, I went to the Buffalo Public Library to do some research on my next book, which was actually going to be a Civil War book. And when I opened up some of the old scrapbooks they had, the first thing I opened to was an article about the Buffalo All-Americans, and I thought it was a little bit too weird that I came across the two similar things in the same week. So I did a little more research, and then I found out it was a pretty fascinating story. I decided to write the book, and it gave me an opportunity to bring together my love of history, my love of football, and my love of writing, and it led to the book Buffalo's Forgotten Champions.
Sure, yeah, and you have a lot of other books too, but in this particular one, we're going to talk about, the Buffalo All-Americans, one of the original teams of the NFL or American Professional Football Association. Let's go ahead and hop on the DeLorean. Let's go to the origin story of the Buffalo All-Americans. How did it all begin?
Well, Buffalo had a semi-pro sandlot team prior to 1920, the 1920 being the year the National Football League or the American Professional Football Association was formed. They had a team in they would play a lot of the Ohio League teams. They had a team called the Buffalo Niagaras that started back in 1916 or so, and they became the Buffalo Prospects around 1919. They played other teams from around New York State, Rochester Jeffersons, teams from Syracuse, and they also played some of the Ohio League teams as well. And that team is the nucleus that became the Buffalo All-Americans in 1920. Some of the players from that team included guys like Barney Lepper and Tommy Hewitt, who became very important in the formation of the Buffalo All-Americans in 1920.
So then 1920, that's really I guess you could say the beginning of the All-Americans?
Yeah, that would really be the beginning of it, because that's, a lot of these players that, the team was named after who were actual All-American players were not on the team prior to that. So when the new professional football league was being started in 1920, a lot of cities wanted to have representation. So the Rochester Jeffersons were there, and most of the Ohio League teams were there. Buffalo did not have a representative at that first meeting in Canton, but they did join the league shortly afterwards. They were considered charter members from the very beginning, but they weren't at the initial meeting. But what happened was, when this team got together, there was no real formal name for it. So the first 3 or 4 weeks, there was no real name other than they called them the Buffalo Professionals, because they didn't have a name like the Lions or the Tigers or whatever. The local newspapers started to call them the All-Americans because there were so many All-Americans on the team. There was Heine Miller, there was Murray Shelton, there was Lou Little, there was Swede Youngstrom, a bunch of guys who had been actual college All-Americans. And the team became known as the All-Americans and just kind of adopted that moniker as their official name, probably somewhere through the season, although there's no official record of when it became called the team became called the All-Americans. But the thing is that, Buffalo was like a lot of other cities that played these sandlot games in the 1910s. They wanted to be in on this new professional football league, thinking maybe someday it's going to be like Major League Baseball. And, and look at some of the teams that were around in those days. You had the Decatur Staleys, who became the Chicago Bears. You had the Chicago Cardinals, who are now the Arizona Cardinals. So a lot of those teams, Green Bay Packers, came in the league in 1921. So this league did evolve into the league we know it today.
Who was backing them financially then, or their owner? Did they have one?
Yeah, they had an owner. His name was Frank McNeil. He was a lawyer, and he was also in the lumber business, I believe. He was the guy with the money behind the league. The initial leases for the Canisius Villa, which is where the All-Americans played their home games, was signed by Barney Lepper, who was a member of the Prospects, and Tommy Hewitt also was there. But it was Lepper and McNeil who signed the lease for the Villa. So, Lepper was considered one of the original owners of the team, and Tommy Hewitt was the coach. So it was the three of them who basically were the movers and shakers behind the team.
So was he active as far as promoting the team, or was it more of he was a financial backer?
McNeil? Oh, he was very active. He was every week, during the week you would see several articles about the football team in the local papers, and there was always McNeil talking up the team or promoting them in some way. There was always some quote from him in the paper to promote the team or the next game. Whoever was coming to town, whether it was Canton Bulldogs or whoever, they usually had a quote from McNeil.
And who did you say was the coach again?
The coach was Tommy Hewitt. Tommy Hewitt was from the University of Michigan, and he had also been the coach of the Buffalo teams in the late 1910s and stayed with the Buffalo All-Americans when they became professional.
So then, this first year they get started, of course, that's, they've been around a little bit in Buffalo before, but that 1920 season, they kind of had a historic pace to start the year off, didn't they?
Yeah, they did. In 1920, the first 7 games of the season, it was just mentioned on Sunday Night Football recently, but the first 7 games of the season, they actually had a 218-point differential between themselves and their opponents. Their aggregate score was 218 points greater than their opponent. The next closest was the New England Patriots of this year, who started out their first 7 games with something like 179 or something like that. I can't remember the score, but they were on some kind of torrid pace at that point. And obviously they weren't playing teams of the caliber that they were equal to, but because they were playing a lot of semi-pro and sandlot teams in those days as well, because a lot of those cities, their teams that were sandlotters, they joined the league and they didn't have these All-Americans like the Buffalo team did. So the Canton Bulldogs, the Buffalo teams, some of these other teams, they had really good rosters, but a lot of the teams like the Muncie Flyers or the Tonawanda Lumberjacks or some of these other teams, they were just a bunch of sandlotters who wanted to join the league and thought if they got into the league, that made them professional. Unfortunately, it didn't work out that way.
Right. So how did Buffalo get all of these All-Americans to play for their team then?
Well, that's one thing I'm not really certain of, other than, probably recruitment by Tom. I'm assuming it was mostly Tommy Hewitt. He had some connections because he had, played in the Ohio League and he had played at Michigan. And so he probably knew a lot of people. He was able to probably entice some of these people like Aki Anderson, Swede Youngstrom, Lou Little, Lud Ray. But I believe it was more than anything, it was the money. I'm sure Frank McNeil gave them a lot more money than they were being offered at somewhere else.
Yeah, because Rochester's, not right down the road, but I guess that'd probably be the closest proximity, and they were pretty much bootstrapping it.
Yeah, Leo Lyons up in Rochester didn't have the kind of money that Frank McNeil had, so they tried to go out and get Jim Thorpe, and they tried to go out and get Red Grange, I believe, but they just didn't have the money to pull it off. And by the time Red Grange was coming in 1925, Buffalo didn't either. So, it took a team that was based in either Chicago or New York that was going to get a player like Jim Thorpe or Red Grange. They were just too high priced.
Yeah, and speaking of, Red Grange, like you said, was a little bit too far down the road, but at the beginning, did they play Jim Thorpe and the Canton Bulldogs in that 1920 season? Yeah,
as a matter of fact, they did. At the end of the season, on December 4th in 1920, they played the Canton Bulldogs at the Polo Grounds in New York, and it was actually the first Major League professional football game to be played in New York City. And attendance estimates are somewhere between 15 and 20,000 that attended, which is pretty great considering here in Buffalo at the Canisius Villa, they were drawing 7,000-8,000 per game. So that was pretty darn good.
Do you know why they played, considering Canton and Buffalo, neither one of them are from New York City? Why did they play in the big city?
Well, Canton would be the logical choice because of Jim Thorpe. They had the biggest name in the sport in that one person right there. And Buffalo, they had accumulated such a great record, and all their players, being All-Americans, were pretty well known. So if you were going to New York City, you've heard of Swede Youngstrom, you've heard of Aki Anderson, you've heard of Murray Shelton. These guys were pretty well known. So it was a good fit. It was a good matchup, and it was a good game. The All-Americans won 7-3. So, here in Buffalo, we can pat ourselves on the back for that.
Right.
Because we've had a few disappointments in more recent years, but that was a pretty big game. The first big game in New York City.
Well, being that was such a big game, 1920, like you said, near the end of the year, they beat the Bulldogs. Does that mean that they ended up being crowned the champions of the first season?
No, unfortunately, that it didn't work out that way. The league in those days did not have a head-to-head playoff or a championship game. What they did was they determined their champion by deciding, or by a winning percentage, by, who had the best winning percentage. And in 1920, the Akron Pros won it because they finished 8-0-3. The All-Americans finished 9-1-1. And if they would have counted the ties as they did later on, okay, the Akron Pros would have had the same percentage as the All-Americans, I think it would have come out to 863 or something like that as a winning percentage for both teams. So it would have been a tie. But because the Akron Pros didn't lose a game, they were given the title.
So did the Buffalo All-Americans ever play against Akron that year then, the champs?
Yeah, they did. On the final game of the season, as a matter of fact, the very next day after playing Canton at the Polo Grounds, they came home to Buffalo and they played Akron, and they played into a 0-0 tie. Akron, of course, was quarterbacked by Fritz Pollard, who was the first African-American head coach in NFL history. But they played them to a 0-0 tie, which left Akron undefeated at 8-0-3 and Buffalo at 9-1-1.
But like you said, they had to play them basically right after they played Canton Bulldogs in New York.
Yeah, but it was a pretty common thing back in those days. You might even see a team play 3 games in one weekend. They might play on Thanksgiving Day and then on Saturday and Sunday. And, that's just kind of the way it was because the players were just playing for the money. So if you were offering them $250 or whatever, the better paid players are making, they're saying, yeah, I'll play it. Yeah, sure. I'll make $750 for, 4 days work. Back in the 1920s, that was pretty darn good money.
Right, yeah, for sure. And, it was a little bit different than it is nowadays with the millionaire contracts and everything and no guarantees. So I would imagine, hey, you got a game to play. Let's strap it up.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and most of the players, the guys who weren't well known, they were making, $50 a game, whatever, 75. It was the guys that were the better known players like the Swede Youngstroms and the Akadi Andersons who were making a little bit more like, $200 a game. If you were an All-American, just like today, the better known you are, the better money you can make.
You keep bringing up Swede Youngstrom. Why do you bring him up so much?
Well, he's one of my favorites. He is, I like to extol him as Buffalo's first true football superstar. He was a guard with the team. He only weighed about 188 pounds, but he was a all-pro guard 3 consecutive years. And I actually have records that show that he may have gotten a couple of more all-pro nods, but the records weren't that well kept back in those days. And the all-pro teams were chosen by different newspapers or whatever. So, but Swede Youngstrom was, let's say, a multiple all-pro, and he played here for 6 years. And the first 2 years, they were 9-1 and 1. And he was just a really good player. And after he left Buffalo, he went to play for the Frankfurt Yellow Jackets, where he won the league championship there. So he's a pretty interesting player. He was an All-American coming out of Dartmouth, and he was a rock for this team.
So would it be safe to say that if you had to vote for somebody to make it in the Professional Hall of Fame, he'd be somebody?
Yeah, I've actually made my feelings about that pretty public. I go on the PFRA website, and I will let people know that I believe Youngstrom is probably the best lineman of the era who's not in the Pro Football Hall of Fame.
Well, maybe someday they'll open it up to some of the real long-time goes. I know this year they're going to be adding more players, but I don't think I've seen his name on there as a finalist.
No, you won't. And it's sad because I think they're probably going to go back and maybe get 2 or 3 people from the 20s and 30s, and then everybody else is going to be from the 50s and beyond it, or 50s and up, I think. And even then it's going to be, maybe a couple guys from the AFL. But, I just don't feel confident that they're going to go back and look at these guys seriously because, quite frankly, I don't think a lot of the historians that are, involved are really that interested in going back that far. They're more interested in names that are more familiar to people. So you're probably not going to see a guy like Swede Youngstrom make it in. There's a couple of guys from the Packers in those days that are being looked at, Labby Dilwig and Laverne Llewellyn. The Buffalo All-Americans never won a championship, so there's really nothing sexy about them.
Yeah, but I mean, like you kind of alluded to it, but that first 2 seasons, they were arguably the best team in the league. I mean, 1921 season, too, they had what I'll call a championship controversy. Can you talk about that a little bit? Controversies, championships. Buffalo? I didn't think they had an NFL championship. Well, I guess maybe we'll find out in the next week's episode, because that's when you're going to have to wait to hear the rest of this interview with Jeff Miller to talk about the 1921 Buffalo All-Americans Championship, or the controversy that was. And also he discusses beyond 1921 about the first NFL team in the Queen City. And if you haven't figured this out, I want to thank Mr. Jeffrey Miller for coming on the show riding shotgun with us on the DeLorean, giving us those gridiron knowledge nuggets about the first NFL team in Buffalo City. I tell you what, there's some pretty cool stories that I myself never even fathomed could have happened. But so goes the 1920s, before the 1920s with professional football and beyond. It's crazy to think how the NFL has got to where it is, now in the 100th season. And we're almost at the end of the 100th season. So, let's take a step back. Let's go ahead and if you like this show, why don't you go ahead and share it with at least one more football geek such as yourself, because we want to make sure everybody knows about the history of the game. And also, if you want to learn more about Jeff Miller and all of his books, you can head to his dedicated page on the website. That's at thefootballhistorydude.com/Jeff Miller. Again, that's thefootballhistorydude.com/Jeff Miller. Now, next week, we're going to go ahead and hear about that 1921 championship. Well, the controversy that was. And learn more about that first NFL team in Buffalo. But for now, dudes, I'm through if you're through.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Football History Dude. To make sure you're the first to get the next episode, please subscribe on your podcast player of choice and head on over to thefootballhistorydude.com for the show notes and more information on the history of the NFL. And remember, dudes, where we're going, we don't need roads.